Welcome to the Behavioral Grooves Podcast. My name is Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. We interview interesting people in order to unlock insights into behavioral science and how we can apply them to work and life.
This episode is sponsored by the new and improved Behavioral Grooves website. Well, maybe not so improved since it's just new.
Just pretty much just new.
Where you can find out all things Behavioral Grooves. The website contains all of our podcasts as well as information on our local meetups that are happening around the nation. As well, you can find out ways to sign up to be a host or sponsor of one of them.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so please check out www.behavioralgrooves.com. That's behavioralgrooves.com, not behavior grooves.
And does this have like all the Behavioral Grooves merch, like t-shirts and underwear and hats and
coming soon?
So this episode is part 2 of our interview with Rob Burnet, the founder of Well Told Story in Nairobi, Kenya. Our discussion with Rob went so well and so long that we decided to break it into 2 separate podcasts, and this episode is part 2.
If you haven't listened yet, part 1 covers the creation of Shujazz, the Nairobi-based graphic novel or comic book. Shujazz means hero in Sheng, the slang spoken by Kenyan youth. If you haven't yet done so, you should definitely check out part 1. Part 2 begins with a Seth Godin story and gets into sociologist James Coleman's working model on how social change occurs, often referred to as Coleman's boat. Rob brought it up as a way to recognize the power of every individual's behavior on social change.
Rob also detailed some research projects he's embarked on with Tulane University and Cambridge University and how they're gathering data from social media posts to measure the change in teenage attitudes toward unprotected sex. So we expand the story of the teaspoon hustle in this episode as well and discovered that a Scotsman living in Nairobi for 25 years still loves the Blues Brothers. Speaking of music, in addition to the theme music that we include on every podcast, we are featuring the Shujazz theme song called The Hustler, and it comes to us with permission from Well Told Story.
So grab a beer, grab an iced tea, grab a yoga mat, or grab the wheel, and we hope you enjoy this part 2 of a Behavioral Grooves interview with Rob. And if you like what we're up to, please check out our new Behavioral Grooves website that we talked about earlier, and definitely give us a rating on the podcast catcher of your choice.
Please, please, please.
5 stars, write a review, let us know how we're doing.
Show us your podcast love.
But right now, please listen to part 2 of our discussion with Rob Burnet.
So I was reading Seth Godin recently, the US marketing guy, who I admire hugely. And he has been talking a lot about this idea that people like us do things like this. So this is this idea that as consumers, as we make purchasing decisions, what we're asking subconsciously is, do people like me wear jeans? Do I? I'm, at my age, can I look around? Do people like me drive a truck, or do we drive a Toyota? Do I wear this hat? Do people like me wear hats like this? And this idea about that I'm always assessing my own position relative to the groups that I believe I belong in, or I would like to belong in, is basically the same story that that people are telling themselves when they shift from the waitress to the cashier, or from 1 tray of eggs to 3 to bulletproof, is saying, yeah, I'm in that group. And then because our media reaches 50% of all the youth in the country, suddenly this thing here becomes normal. The life that I have around me, when I've never met anyone who's succeeded. I don't know anyone who's ever made it. Oh, but actually I keep reading about people. I keep hearing about them on the radio. People just like me who are behaving a little bit differently to me. And their lives seem to be on track. So maybe actually what I thought was normal is abnormal. Maybe that's the normal. So actually what we've discovered is we're kind of retrofitting norms. We don't need to build consensus to build a norm. What we can do is establish a norm in the shape of an aspiration and share it at scale until it becomes the norm. So, and there's a model for that called Coleman's boat, which is this idea about how you can retro-construct a norm through establishing the viability and attractiveness of a behavior and waiting for people to fall in line with that, rather than building the mental preparedness that leads to a consensus norm.
Well, you are a behavioral scientist. There you go.
Yeah. So, Rob, what was that called? You said Coleman's boot? What was?
Coleman, like the mustard, Coleman's boat.
Yeah.
Okay.
Coleman's boat.
The model looks like a boat. And Coleman, I think, was a psychologist from Yale, Princeton, one of those places. It's very Googleable. Coleman's boat.
We will Google and we'll put it in. What you're talking about is really, again, it's social proof from a behavioral science literature. What you're talking about is social proof that you have this, my tribe, right? Who I identify with. What are they doing? Because I don't want to be seen as away from that. And if that I identify with the successful tribe of who that is, you're going to, I love the retrofitting norms. It's a wonderful term. So,
well, this was discovered recently by farmers who didn't want to, who had a lot of information available to them about the challenges of weeds in the United States, and weeds that were coming into areas where they weren't really outfitted to manage them. And of course, in order to manage them, they needed more sustainable farming methods. And in order to do that, they would have to do, in their mind, they would have to change. And they said, well, we've got all the information, but we are rejecting that. We're rejecting that because I don't think that that's really going to happen to me, or all the rationalization that goes along with it. Until the in-tribe people, the other farmers, stood up and said, hey, I've made these changes, and look what my farm looks like. I've got clean fields. And so social proof, as Kurt alluded to, is tremendously powerful stuff. And I'm so glad that you're using it in such a positive and powerful way. This is terrific, Rob.
So what's interesting now is that we've been running a panel study with the economics department from Tulane University in New Orleans. So that's enabled us to track a cohort of young people, some of whom are our fans and some of whom are not, over the last, well, we're now into our third year. So as you probably know, we run a whole number of different studies. I think we're running 14 parallel studies at the moment. So one of them, every year we do this cross-sectional study, which is a national survey, and we look at randomly sampled young people, and it gives us a sense of what does youthful Kenya look like. But that doesn't tell us, that can't get us to causality. That doesn't explain what our media is actually creating or not. It gives us a ratio. But when you run a panel and you're going back and talking to the same people, then you can run regression analysis. You're then in a position to be able to isolate cause and effect with a very high degree of attribution. So this panel study has allowed us for the first time, just in the last couple of months, to see very, very clearly what the causal outcomes of exposure to our media are. So what's interesting is, there's really a huge amount of data, and it's fascinating, well, for me anyway. But one of the things is, obviously, our main way of getting at contraception uptake has livelihoods innovation. So the story of Winnie and her eggs ends up as a pro-contraception story, and we barely even mention the contraception piece. We just tack it on. We call it the peel, because it's that last thing at the end. Oh, hang on, one last thing, the peel. But the main thrust of the story is, how do we give people the tools they need to economically empower themselves, and how do we give them the agency, the feeling that they can do it? So in the panel, we've looked at a couple of things. One of them is the economic fortunes of our fans. So we're looking at contraception use, which has basically increased among our most ardent fans, which is about 1 million people who follow us on social media and one other linear analog platform, we've got about an 18% increase in contraception use, regular contraception use.
Wow.
And what's also interesting is that, and that's only it. So the most ardent fan, about 1 million are showing that. And then we've got another group who are not quite so ardent, who are also showing an effect, but it's just slightly reduced. So the overall effect is really profound. But what's also interesting is that it turns out that these same fans end every month with $22.7 more in their pocket than our non-fans. And that's attributable, at least there's a causal link between us and that $23. And it may not seem a lot, but the average amount of money that a Kenyan youth sees in a month is only $27. So actually it's almost double. And it's associated with this story, this exposure to the story we're telling. So, and what gets also a bit crazy is when you think, well, it's $22.7 a month, it's $250 something a year, it's knocking on 1 million people. It's suddenly $170 million put into the youth economy, causally put there by exposure to this story, and a story which is constantly saying, you can do this. You got this. You can do it. People like you are making little changes, and look at the success they're enjoying. Yeah. Is there any difference between you and them? I don't think there is. And so we're quite excited about that data, as you can imagine. And there's lots of other spin-outs, but those are the two kind of stark numbers there. But there's
huge.
Along the way, what we've also been able to do is to analyze really the theory of change. So how does a comic, a story, lead to a behavioral outcome? What are the steps by which a media experience actually translates into a behavioral outcome? So very interesting, right? So we've had a theory for some time, which is that collective discussion leads to collective belief. And we've been tracking that. So we've been saying, well, can we link conversation to perception? And we've tracked that in a number of ways. So, for example, with the University of Cambridge in the UK, we've taught a computer in England how to speak Sheng, which is the slang that our audience uses. And we're now able to read the millions of online social media conversation that we generate. And we're able to show that over 3 years, we increased the number of people who were voluntarily talking about contraception went up by 5,000% in our audience. And the sentiment went from overwhelmingly negative to overwhelmingly positive. And it also went from he, she, they, them, I'm asking for a friend, to me, I, us, we. And you can see it on a graph, how the sentiment and the subject matter shifts, it moves, the proximity changes over time. So we were very happy with that. But we couldn't say that shift led to a behavior. I mean, we argued that conversation is a behavior, right? That actually what we're able to do is we can get people to talk about subjects that they weren't talking about before. And that's actually one of the outcomes. So in our theory of change, what we're saying is massive scale media, authentic, stories based on human-centered design, real life role models, real life stories, distributed at scale. Step one goes to step two, which is love. It's brand love. And something close to 85, 87% of the people who have ever seen us then subscribe to 2 or more of our brand love indicators. So do they really feel it? Do they recommend it to a friend? Do they recognize themselves in the story? Do they feel that it's talking about them? Do they connect with it? Do they use it to make decisions? Do they learn from it? So from brand love, we see 2 things happen. The first thing that we can show causally happens is that audience members talk about different subjects than non-audience members. So our audience talk about the taboo topics that we have introduced, and they talk about them with a wider social network than our non-audience. And that's important too. So firstly, they're willing to go there and talk about sex, which is highly stigmatized here in East Africa. But also they don't just talk to their most promiscuous friends about sex, which is something that we've previously seen. if you're a teenager, who do you get your sex advice from? Your most promiscuous friend. Possibly not the best source, right? Whereas our audience talk to that person, and they talk to their auntie and their big brother and their sisters and their cousins and so on. So and then the second outcome we can see in the data is that our audience define normality differently. So we define a norm as what I think you expect me to do.
Mm-hmm.
So there are several different definitions of a norm, but that's the one we subscribe to. So we at all of our surveys to say, what do you think she wants from you? What do you think he expects you to do under these circumstances? So, for example, if we're back to the contraception story, is it okay for a girl to carry a condom on a date? That's a really key one. Or indeed, whose responsibility is it to bring a condom on a date? So that would be a good kind of T-junction question for us to decide what's your norm on that. So our audience perceive normality differently from our non-audience. So now we've framed a different conversation, and we can show that normal starts to be defined differently. And as a direct consequence of that, we see a behavioral change. So we now see people living out those fresh norms. So they are taking condoms on dates. They are investing in small businesses. They are saving money. They are using digital financial services on their phones. They are thinking about the future. They are more optimistic. They are voting. They are registering in the local government offices. They are innovating. They are full of agency. And actually, above all, that's the metric on which we score highest, is this idea of agency, the feeling that you can, the feeling that you have control, that the locus of control sits with you. And we ultimately are increasingly of the view that that is the key ingredient, and that actually people with agency make good decisions. And maybe that's all we need to do, is give people agency. The rest they will figure out for themselves.
Well, and you're not trying to figure it out for them. You're abstaining from the editorial that says these are the shoulds and the shouldn'ts.
We let our audience do that. We let our audience do that.
Yeah, but that whole idea of the collective, collective discussion becomes the collective belief. This is evident in the United States political system. The norms have changed dramatically in terms of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, based on the kind of leadership and the kind of dialogue that has gone on with the leadership of what's acceptable and what's not. What are the things that we're talking about? Why are we willing to talk about them? And now
it happened so fast.
It did.
There was a great article in the New Yorker called "The New Normal," which came out in the course of last year. Perhaps you saw it.
I did.
The opening story was how, within a few days of the election, swastikas were painted on Jewish gravestones in Brooklyn, and
yes.
But in addition, the point was that they were painted wrongly.
That they were neo-Nazis
were people
who weren't well experienced in being neo-Nazis.
They were trying out their Nazism because they had suddenly been given, apparently in their own perception, they'd been given license to do so. There was a new normal.
And a dramatic change. Kurt, what else?
I have just been, this has been fascinating because, again, to every talking agency, talking, locus of control, these are all behavioral components. And so it's this experiment at a scale that is massive around concepts or ideas that are important, that I think is just, I am actually in awe. So this has been fascinating for me in all of these things. The one thing I do want to ask on just on the end, you talked about all the behavior change that you've seen and different things, but are you getting kids going to the county budget meetings?
You know, the funny thing is we are. We ended up developing a project which we call the Policy Fight Club.
Okay.
And, so we finally did a bit of a segmentation analysis on our audience to show that, okay, the vast majority of young Kenyans, the quote we got was, they don't even know if they care, right? They're so far in the rejection space, don't even bother me with this stuff. And then we had a few people who were kind of hanging near the door, but unfortunately they were like stooges. So the young people who were willing to consider going to the budget hearing, only doing so because they've got a cousin who's going to give them a contract at the end,
Yeah,
and then there were a couple of other segments who were cross, frustrated, and angry. So actually what we've ended up doing is we've been calling those people together into these policy fight clubs. Now, the sad truth of the matter is that our client for this work, which was the World Bank, became uncomfortable with the notion of a fight club. So we had to water it down, which is one of my great sadnesses. We have to call it a policy handshake now, which is really a retreat from so we call them PFCs in our office, because a PFC, at least we know where it came from. We know it came from a fight club. But we have these events where we call local county officials together, and we recruit from our online audience the angry and the frustrated, the guys who at least have some energy to show up. And we have a debate. But we ask each side to represent the other argument.
Yeah.
So the local officials have to pretend that they're youth and and then we have a really engaging day. And we record the whole thing. So we film it and we document it. And so on the day, and a great experience is had by all. Usually the local officials are scared when they come.
Oh,
and
yeah.
they leave friends and great things have happened. And then we take the highlights of the story and we play those back to our national audience, to the I don't even know if I cares. So to those guys, we just say every month, we go, oh, by the way, we were in Burnett for a policy handshake last week, and we had a great time. Look at this. Here's a quote from the county guy. Here's a quote from the local party person. Here's a quote from the kids who came along. Here's a quote from the guys who run the motorcycle taxi rank. They're all telling us a fantastic story about new understanding and cooperation. Interesting. End. No value judgment, just to say, you thought nothing was moving. We're here to tell you, you might be wrong. And what we're seeing is, over time, that the heads are turning, the extreme heads are turning. Okay, maybe there's something, maybe there's a value in this, maybe democracy can work. Mm-hmm. And our angry guys are saying, I'm on it. I know whose door I'm going to knock on. And the county, meanwhile, are saying, wow, those young people are not as problematic as I thought. Maybe we should leave the door open for them next time. Yeah. Maybe it's not just my wife's nephew who gets in the room. So it's an interesting one, and we're mapping the process. So yes, in the end, the answer, a very few have attended.
So one of the big things that we see, one of the big tools or blind spots that we have is status quo bias. That we are much more. It's hard for us to give up the status quo, and you're obviously successfully overcoming status quo bias with these campaigns, with the communication, with the well-told story, because you're getting people to discard the status quo in favor of a new norm. Yep. One of the things that comes to my mind, though, Rob, is what about the government? What about the policy leaders? They have a status quo that they're engaged in, that they are wedded to, just like everyone else is. What about them? What about them?
So it's true that I must say that we are about to change our strategy with regard to government, and that's mostly because for the last several years we have decided to keep our heads down. That actually our audience are only interesting to the government in an election year, for that cynical purpose that led them to enrage young people in 2007 and beginning of 2008. So in terms of, there's an extraordinary blind spot actually when it comes from government looking at young people, but it starts to change. And so we have decided in the last few years to say, actually, we're going to focus fully on our target. We're not going to be concerned with government. We're going to drive behavior from the ground up. And if we can find a way to work with government along the way, we will. But actually, we're not going to allow that to become our mission. And I think that these days we are a little bit more of a force in the world, and we are more widely acknowledged for our work. And I think we are now having quite constructive conversations with sort of senior leaders and also junior leaders. So at the level of our policy handshakes, very good engagement there. And I think we're also now starting to get some very good engagement right at the top. So I think this year, actually, as an organization, we're starting, and even this morning, actually, I was meeting on this to say, how do we bring what we've learned and what we can do to the, at least firstly, to the attention of government, because we don't agree with a lot of their policies when it comes to young people, but also they don't know what our young people are doing, and they don't know what we're seeing. So the data we've been collecting on, for example, around the election, when we were trying to understand what are young people really talking about. So the assumption is that young people are throwing slanderous ethnic barbs at one another online like everyone else. But actually our data shows that young people are only talking about elections as the 6th most relevant topic. Even in the month of an election, they're firstly talking about infrastructure, they're talking about employment, they're talking about civil rights, they're talking about healthcare, and they're talking about corruption, and only then were they talking about elections. And that's news, it turns out here. No one we've shown that data to can really believe that to be the case, because everyone assumes that everyone is just wrapped up in basically election fever. Not the case. Young people are deeply concerned with the big underpinning issues of facing the country. And actually, so that's a story we are now beginning to tell to senior leadership. Wow. And it's only made possible because we're able to see a stream of data go past us that until very recently was actually invisible to the human eye. And it's only because we've been able to apply technology to analyzing that data and to processing it that we're able to give meaning to what would otherwise be an impossible volume of individual opinions. But we can aggregate them into a vast consumable data set. It's super interesting.
It does sound super interesting, and I think the other piece you're creating that collective discussion this time with different audiences, right? So
I hadn't thought of that. That's nice. That's very good. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I again, just a very fascinating component, and to that point where you have scale now and you have the technology to start doing some of that analysis, I think the next 2 to 5 years, you're going to be finding some other insights that probably, again, we make assumptions. We make assumptions as humans because we go, well, this is the way I think, so therefore the rest of the world thinks like I think, and we don't. We are all in our own little pocket, and unless we understand that pocket, we make major assumptions.
I think that the other thing to mention there is that we're also very careful with that data side. That at the moment, I mean, we absolutely only analyze the data that we have in our server given to us by people who correspond with us. And we're not doing that kind of extended scraping that Cambridge Analytica and others are being accused of. And I think we have we spent some time last year actually working on a data policy where we set out our own, what we consider to be the ethical boundaries of what we're willing to do within the kind of landscape of European law, which is the kind of the leader on that, even though Kenyan law is very, very lax on this. But we also think that that's extremely important, is that one of the things we want to be able to do in future is to allow our audience to benefit from the data that we've been able to collect. So, for example, young people find it very hard to get access to loans, to borrow money, because they have no credit history. So how can we create a behavioral trail by gathering data that people give us knowingly and enable people ultimately to take that to the bank and say, well, here's proof of who I am and the decisions and behaviors that I've been displaying over the last years. Can we present that in a format that allows the bank to give them credit terms. And it looks like they will. So we're quite far down that discussion. So we're working on an API with a microfinance bank that will enable our audience to access funds based on their data trail.
That data trail, though, is a social media data trail. Where's the data trail coming from?
So
is it self-reported, or is there any objectivity with it? This is fascinating.
Well, it's self-reported but it's also quite bias-free, because it's spontaneously generated social media exchanges. So a bulk of it is what people have said, when and how and to whom over a long period, with us in the conversation. But there's something else we're building, which we're calling the Hustler MBA. So thinking about our girl with the eggs.
Yeah.
How did she know how to do that?
The teaspoon hustle.
The teaspoon hustle.
Yeah.
So the truth of the matter, the extraordinary truth is that every year in Kenya, about 1.3 million people enter the job market. And about 10% are going to get a formal job. So that's what the World Bank says, about 10% will get formal, like, here's a contract, you start on Monday. Everybody else is going to be in some form of informal employment. Many of them are going to have to hustle. They're going to have to figure it out for themselves, how they're going to stay ahead, how they're going to keep their heads above water. So our girl Winnie came from rural. She ended up in the city. She's on the bones of her ass. She's going to have to make it work. She figured something out. So how do we formalize that knowledge? How do we make that a community where people can exchange? So we're building this online MBA. We're calling it the Hustler MBA, where we're finding Kenya's top hustlers to teach what they know. So rather than learning it from your most promiscuous friend, as it were, you can learn it from the best, but in an entirely informal peer-to-peer way, but with online video, with questions. So what we've done is we've taken a set of different sort of formal curricula, and we've dissolved that down into some principles. And now we're documenting the hustle journeys of a whole number of very different but very low barrier to entry small businesses. And we're saying, so tell us your way of managing these processes. So how did you get inspired? Where did you just get the money from? How did you choose the location? How did you choose the hustle? How do you treat your customers? How do you do your marketing? How do you do branding? How do you negotiate your inputs? How do you handle the money? How do you manage your staff? What are you going to do next? And we're having all of our hustlers tell us that story. And then we're chopping it up into little classes. So now you can hear 20 different people in 20 different businesses tell us how they do their marketing, or how they handle their cash. Or indeed, you can just follow one of those hustlers all the way along to find out how they've made their small business into a success. And along the way, we're gonna make you take some quizzes and develop some knowledge, so that by the end, we really do have a trail which tells us quite a lot about you that you can then take to the bank. So it's going to be a combination of that data and several years of social media data, which together can be crunched into a profile, into a persona that the bank is willing to extend a loan to.
And this is a non-traditional bank. This is not a formal savings and loan kind of thing.
No,
yeah, this is a micro lender. That's
it's a youth-focused micro lender. Yeah. So we'll see. We're not there yet, but we're getting quite close.
That's absolutely terrific. The working with people sort of on the edge of the norms and helping them find new norms is absolutely terrific.
Well, we should probably start wrapping up.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
Which you know what that means, Kurt.
Oh yes, it's Tim. Tim always has his music question. So did we prep Rob? Did you even let him know this was coming?
I read something about it, but I don't remember what's coming next.
Good. Well, so we call ourselves the Behavioral Grooves because we have a behavioral science nerd aspect and we have a music nerd aspect. And so we bring both of those things. Yes, you're smiling. That's good.
I'm a musician, so I'm happy to hear it.
Brilliant. So that's even better. But I'm still scratching my head about how do we talk about music from a Scot that's living in Nairobi that wrote a story about a DJ that is inciting behavioral change. But okay, so let's just start with just a couple of questions. We'd like to talk about what music defines you, or what music would be your theme music. But let's start with what do you listen to?
Bit of blues, bit of Beethoven, bit of bagpipe music.
Got the three big B's there: blues, Beethoven, and bagpipes. Yeah, that's good. What blues do you like to listen to?
I'm a eclectic listener. I've been listening to John Lee Hooker recently. I like some really old stuff. I'm a harmonica player, so anything with a harmonica in it gets me going. Sonny Boy Williamson. The highest point of my entire musical life was playing an evening with Dan Aykroyd. He and I and a band I was in on a stage set up in the desert in southern Kenya. And he and his friends arrived by helicopter. We didn't know who was coming. They touched down. We'd been told to be there with our instruments and a PA system. And we had an evening playing music with Dan Aykroyd. And,
wow.
That was my greatest musical moment. So,
wow.
Yeah.
So if let's make this grandiose. Emmy is one thing, but let's say you win the Nobel Prize.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Let's get grandiose. What is the music that you would want to have played as you cross the stage receiving your Nobel Prize?
The theme tune to Shujazz, the theme tune to our radio show.
Good answer.
And,
All right.
Would we have your permission to play that on the episode?
I'll send it to you. I'll send you the groove.
Great. That sounds terrific. Rob Burnet, thank you so much for your time, your contributions, your discussion. This was absolutely delightful, and we really appreciate you being a part of the Behavioral Grooves podcast today.
Well, thank you very much. I'm honored to have been invited. I've enjoyed the conversation very much. I look forward to another encounter in future.
Are you ready to groove?
I am ready to groove. Welcome to our grooving session, where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our Behavioral Grooves interview, have a free-flowing discussion on some of those topics, and whatever else comes into our skulls.
Skulls. Oh, man, it's getting more anatomical all the time.
So, Tim, part 2 of our interview with Rob, what were some of the things that stuck out to you?
Well, this overarching story of how a comic book is leading social change is just it's just overwhelming to me. It's such a great lesson to sort of the rest of the world, as far as I'm concerned, that we have this opportunity to, of course, we are being shaped by the media that we consume. And here, this is a group, Well Told Story is going into the market with a very intentional and carefully crafted message for their audience. And it's having these positive, powerful effects on the youth in Kenya and Tanzania.
Yeah, and I want to get back to the part about how the media shapes us, because I think that's an important thing, and I think there's a larger issue that we can think about from all of us, and what the media that we consume and how that shapes our ideas and our thoughts and various different things. But to go into a well-told story, I love how they're using the variety of media to really make a difference. And the components of all of the different media that they're using to shape the conversations that are happening, to change the dialogue and the self-schemas of how people think about themselves, as well as looking at that social change. So talk to me a little bit about Coleman's Boat. I know we briefly discussed it in the interview with Rob.
Yeah.
But help me understand a little bit more about what that contains, and what are some of the aspects of that model.
It went by really quickly, and I think it's a very powerful model that hasn't been discussed a lot in recent years. So James Coleman was at the University of Chicago, and what he was trying to do was track the way social change happens, and what role does the individual play in that. And so he divided into two groups: the macro change and the micro change. The macro change being sort of the social change of, say, at an institutional level, and the micro change happening at an individual level. And said that let's say that if we're starting with a social element, that there is going to have to be a micro. If there's a macro change that's going to happen, a micro element has to change as well. We have to change our behaviors individually in order for the social side, the macro side, to change. And so Coleman drew a very simple diagram as a tool to better understand how social at a macro and micro level changes. And what he ended up with was something that looks sort of like a boat. And so
a boat,
a boat,
a
yes.
Viking boat,
kind of not
big cruiser, sailboat. What kind of boat are we talking about?
This is probably more like a Japanese junk is really probably what it is. It's a modest sized boat with an equally, the bow and the back of it are about equal, and it's just a straight line across the top and a straight line across the bottom.
Okay.
But this micro change influences the macro change, and the macro change influences the micro change, and this Coleman's boat was just a tremendously powerful tool when he developed it, and I was really glad that Rob brought it up, so we have a chance to remind people of it, and we'll probably put a link to it in the notes, so that people can go after it.
Yeah.
But what did you think about what's being tracked, Kurt? I mean, the fact that Rob's got partners at Cambridge and Tulane tracking the social media access.
14 parallel studies that are going on at the moment. And I will go back to our conversation with Mike Ahern and talking about organizations and how organizations don't track or measure their sales incentives.
Yes.
And you look at the impact that these guys are having, and partly, I think, because they do this tracking and they do the research to understand what works, what doesn't work, what are the things that they can improve upon. And it's a great lesson, I think, for all of us to take back to our organizations, whether they be a nonprofit, whether they be a for-profit, whether they be a small company, whether they be a large company. We need to understand how what we do impacts the people that we're trying to serve. And they're doing a fantastic job with this.
They really are. I don't want to let this grooving session end without talking about the teaspoon hustle, because for two reasons. One is it's such a great image, right, for us to get our heads around this idea that something so small as a teaspoonful of whatever it is, of confidence, a teaspoonful of grit gets us to the next day. And in the corporate world that we work in, I have often seen companies focusing less on the teaspoon and more on the big issues. They focus more on sort of climbing Everest and forget about, in order to climb Everest, you have to go through training and dietary changes and all kinds of things.
Acclimation. You have to put one foot in front of the other just to get up to base camp, and then from base camp to camp 2, and keep moving
each one.
And I think there's a component there. I think you can't just focus on the teaspoons, because you're missing out on that big picture. People are going, why am I climbing? Why am I taking this? Why am I training? What am I doing the step?
And that's what that big, hairy, audacious goal is out there. It answers the why.
Right. But the how comes into this teaspoon component. What do we do every day? What do we consistently do in order to achieve our goals? One of the lines that Rob said is, the main thrust of the story is, how do we give people the tools they need to economically empower themselves? And how do we give them the agency, the feeling that they can do it?
Yeah.
And you think about that comment. It's how do we give them the tools, not necessarily just to be able to do it, but to give them the agency or the feeling that they can accomplish it. And so often, I think we just throw tools at organizations, I'm saying.
Yeah.
Throw out tools. They throw out the new program. They throw out this communication without really thinking about, are we providing our people with the agency, with that feeling that they can accomplish whatever it is that you're trying to get them to do, which is so important to driving change. So it's a lesson. Again, I will say that, Rob doesn't call himself a behavioral scientist, but man, he is getting all of the behavioral science components right. So
absolutely. I know that when we were talking about this earlier, you wanted to talk about the actual impact, some of the data, right? Some of the measures, the actual impact that Shujazz and Well Told Story are having on the youth in Kenya.
Yeah. So when he was talking about the increase in safe sex practices, in other words, using a condom when among their most ardent fans. So those people who are following them on social media and one other analog platform. And there was an 18% increase in contraception use, in regular contraception use.
That's just tremendous.
18%.
Yeah.
To think that, think about how many lives that's changing. That's a million plus people
in the community,
yeah. and
in that target audience,
and you're only growing. And so the impact that has, as well as then you go back to the story of Winnie, and again, it's an N of one, but the change that she was able to accomplish of taking her business to the next level and increasing their monthly income by almost doubling it. Yeah. Those small changes that they're doing through a comic book, through social media, through an FM radio station. I look at the work that I do and I sit there and I go, wow, yeah.
and with Winnie, the part of the great example, or the part of the story, is that her success in business is coupled with her success as a sexually active teenager. Mm-hmm. That the fact that she is now bulletproof has this twofold benefit to her that is huge.
Yeah,
it's huge.
And going back to Coleman's boat, right? Those individual changes which drive the larger societal changes, and changing some of the norms. Like, it's okay to carry a condom on a date. And for women to do that is now socially acceptable because of some of the things that they are putting in place. I think that is vastly powerful in thinking through what media can do, which takes me back into the media that we listen to, and how is that shaping our own thoughts and beliefs. And we've had this conversation before of how if we segregate what we listen to or what we watch or what we read, it lends itself into forming our own tribes of thought and perception, and the confirmation bias that comes with that, and is only reinforced by the media that we hear. And I think it's leading us down a path that isn't one that is positive, at least in the United States. And I think across the world, I think there's more and more of this. I think with the advent of the internet and the variety of different news outlets that are out there, that you can self-select into hearing only the things that I already agree with. All too easily is a very negative component. And I would urge our listeners, I know it's hard, I try to do this, I find myself all the time going into news outlets that agree with my already preconceived ideas.
It's easy.
Well, and I don't
like
get
brain
mad.
Candy.
I don't get mad. I get mad. I go, how can you be so stupid when I go to those others? Because it's just in disagreement with my pre-held beliefs. And I have to actually stop and take a moment to pause and say, just look at that from a different perspective. And I'm not saying I'm perfect. I'm not saying it has changed my viewpoint, 180.
Well,
but it does.
Cal
give me,
Turnbull would be asking,
yeah,
is it changing your view to some degree, though?
I think it is. It's giving me a better insight into, why do some people believe what they believe when I go, that's just crazy horseshit.
Yeah.
How can you step in that and not smell it? Well,
this is where I really value the research community, the academic community of scientists, that if there's a theory out there and somebody has evidence that it's not working, they bring that evidence, and the whole community, we still have to deal with our own biases.
Oh, yes.
At the same time, if there's evidence, then we have to accept that and move on, or we test it. We run trials, and can we replicate this?
Wouldn't it be great? Wouldn't it be great?
Oh, are you like going straight to utopia on this?
I am going to Utopia 2.0. If we took that scientific process into how we viewed much of our lives, right?
It's so hard, though.
It is hard.
It's too hard. I think our brains are too. How about this? Our brains are too lazy.
Our brains are very lazy, and so part of this is let's work out our brains.
Okay,
let's get our brains on a workout regimen. Let's have ourselves do a daily exercise of taking one viewpoint of a different stilt. Like if you're a liberal, go out and watch Fox News for 10 minutes. If you're a conservative, go out and watch MSNBC.
Just try to
whatever
digest
it is.
something different.
And look at it through eyes that aren't critical, that you don't automatically just throw out.
So you have to dial down the judgmentalism, right?
Dial that down.
Yeah. Okay.
Utopia 2.0.
You know what? I'd like to go there. I would. I have to admit, I'd like to go there. But right now, it's that time in our episode discussion.
This is the teaser from part 1, isn't it?
Yes, this is the teaser.
Oh.
So I just have to bring up the fact that I'm still just sort of impressed and sort of surprised that Rob Burnet still loves the Blues Brothers from so many years ago.
What's your favorite Blues Brothers song?
Ooh. You know what? I'm having trouble coming up with the name. I can see them.
Yeah.
See, this is the problem with the video experience. It's so many of those were Sam and Dave tunes, and so it's
a wish sandwich.
I
love Dan Aykroyd when he's like, "What do you have?"
Wish. Yeah. Or of course, one of the great lines was, "We're in a car with sunglasses on at night."
Yeah. Half a tank of gas, or full pack of cigarettes, and a full whatever it was. Bad on those quotes. Anyway, we're going to talk other music.
Yeah. So I'm curious, since we just heard the Shujazz theme song, "The Hustler."
Mm-hmm.
From Kenya, and this is a very contemporary thing. But what music do you listen to from outside the U.S. and the UK? Because I know that you have a lot of UK bands that you love to listen to.
So I have a variety. I will go with our last one that we did. I talked about my favorite outdoor concert, and we talked about the Tragically Hip. They're Canadian. So
okay, all right, okay.
Canadian.
It's Canadian, all right.
It's
Okay.
Canadian. There are. I could go back to my high school days and my heavy metal thing, and I listened to the Scorpions. A good German band.
Yeah, German. Yeah,
there you go. You have. I was introduced to a band. From Australia called Powderfinger when I was there, which is a fantastic band. Although my favorite Australian artist is Tim Minchin, who's more of a comedian than he is a musician.
Yeah.
However, White Wine in the Sun is probably my favorite holiday song ever.
From Tim Minchin.
Tim Minchin.
I notice you haven't mentioned Men at Work when it comes to any of your favorite Australian bands.
No, I have not entered Men at Work. What was the song that they had? What was that song there?
I Come from the Land Down Under.
I Come from the Land Down Under. The Vegemite sandwich.
Yes.
So there you go.
Yeah.
And then I have one last one, which is an Estonian indie rock band.
Estonian. That's from Estonia.
Estonia, that small country up there by Finland and Russia. And,
is that part of the Balkans, or is that too far north?
No, the Baltic, right? I should know this. I had an au pair from Estonia who introduced me to this band, and I went and saw them live.
And what's the band?
7th Street Entry. Oh. It's called Ewert and the Two Dragons.
Ewert and the Two Dragons.
Ewert and the Two Dragons, which I don't understand because it's a 4-member band, so it's not like the lead singer and then the rest of the Dragons. I don't get the reference, but maybe it's some Estonian thing.
That was like the Thompson Twins and Two Non-Blondes. Those are the name of the band had nothing to do with the band's makeup, which kind of drove me crazy personally.
But they're a really good band, and I went and saw them live. I liked them. I got their album. I listened. Actually, they got a couple of their albums.
Oh, cool.
Yeah,
that's cool.
They're a fun band. And your non-U.S. or U.K. bands.
Well, you just went on for Eva there. Holy smokes. What, you're just on El Fuego. You're just on fire with the non-US based bands. But I wanted to talk about first African music.
Okay.
Dub is a pretty common African music, and it's prevalent around the entire continent.
Okay.
So you can catch dub in a variety of different ways. And if you haven't checked out dub music, you can check out Dr. Dub or Professor Dub. How great is that? I mean, so easy. Dr. Dub or Professor Dub. And I don't know where they get this academic thing going, but it's dub is sort of a close cousin to reggae music. So if you like reggae, you could check out dub, and you're just getting sort of the the one rung up on the genealogical tree, the musicological tree there.
Okay.
So if you check out some of that.
And what is dub music like? Is it beat based?
It's beat based, but it's very, very similar to reggae.
Okay.
So if you listen to Bob Marley and you listen to the reggae, so the drumming beat and is kind of similar, but dub is more Spartan. Dub is it's more bass and drum, and the guitar tends to be much less, or a keyboard, and the vocal tends to be much less. It's really the whole emphasis is just on the drum and bass.
So my son listens to dub beat.
Yeah, dubstep.
Dubstep.
Yeah. So that's an Americanization of dub. That actually comes from house music, which is totally different. That's it's closer to rap than it is to reggae.
See, I love this is like a musical education in a podcast about behavioral science. Here you go. So beyond dub, what else? What are some specifics?
Well, I want to. There's Dr. Dub or Professor Dub are really great to check out. So I would recommend that. Someone who has come into my review recently is Field Rotation, and it's a German band that is into this atmospheric kind of music that was introduced to me by my son Connor, who travels the world as a circus performer. And Field Rotation is just lush, and it's this incredibly complex mix of both acoustic and electronica, and it's tremendously emotional stuff. It's very, very highly emotional music, and it's just beautiful. But I want to end on I'm a guitarist, so I love guitar music. And
you're now calling yourself a guitarist. This is a major step for you, Tim.
I'm pulling at the cords of self-identity strongly. And
that'll be a whole nother podcast, folks. We'll go into that.
We will. And I love Spanish guitar.
Okay.
Flamencan music specifically. The technique is phenomenal. So Paco de Lucia.
Okay.
And if you're not familiar with Paco de Lucia, I think he's in his late 60s now, but has traveled the world spreading flamencan music just with generosity. And he's a super cool guy and just a phenomenal instrumentalist at the same time. So
I like flamenco. That's good stuff.
Yeah. Okay. So with that, we want to say thank you very much. We want to say goodbye in Kenyan. I don't know how to do that, but
adios.
Adios. But we want to say thank you. Check us out on your favorite podcatcher. Give us a nice review if you would. We would really appreciate it. Even though we're listened to in 54 countries, we're always looking for one more. Always looking for one more.
And so share this with your friends and family, and listen in next time.